be a dangerous year.
We're seeing an acceleration in their program and very significant advances.
The pace of testing and the success of the tests were really not predicted by the...
Just because they haven't proven that capability doesn't mean they don't have it.
We've laid down so many red lines, it's beginning to look like a red carpet.
You know, talking to the North Koreans is not the problem.
Neither side is really going to be motivated to sit down and talk.
We all agree that China is the key.
Chinese do not want to be responsible for delivering the death blow to the regime.
So far, they've been focused only on the pressure.
But the sanctions are going to take months to bite.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome. I'm Eun-jung Cho. As the year 2017 winds down, today on Washington Talk, we'll take a look back at the year's biggest events that impacted North Korea. First, we'll discuss North Korea's reckless provocations and the international community's all-out pressure campaign. North Korea has made major strides in its long-range missile and nuclear program this year in defiance of UN resolutions.
핵탄두 폭발 시험이 성공적으로 진행되었으며 대륙간 탄도 로켓 시험 발사 준비 사업이 마감 단계에 이른 것을 비롯하여
미국 본토 전역을 타격할 수 있는 초대형 중량급 핵탄두 장착.
This is the most stringent set of sanctions on any country in a generation.
The weapons you are acquiring are not making you safer. They are putting your regime in grave danger.
Now joining me today, Mr. Frank Januzzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And also my guest today, Mr. Douglas Paul, vice president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also held positions at the National Security Council and also at the State Department. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Douglas, let me begin with you. How would you define year 2017 in terms of North Korea's missile and nuclear developments?
Well, it's been a year of tremendous advancements. The pace of testing and the success of the tests were really not predicted by to the extent of my knowledge, by the intelligence community and the policy community. And so they've been trying to catch up in terms of international coordination and unilateral and multilateral responses to North Korea's new capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Frank, was this a watershed year?
Well, for certain, this was a year during which the North Koreans, by their own definition, achieved the capability to put a nuclear warhead to the United States on a missile. Now, most of us studying their program, we still have some doubts about that. They haven't proven a reentry vehicle. They haven't tested a missile at range. And we haven't even seen them mount a nuclear warhead onto a missile and see how that affects the flight. But for certain, this year, more than any of the years that preceded it, is a year during which they had both unprecedented success and also rolled out not one, not two, but three new missile variants. So we're seeing an acceleration in their program and very significant advances.
Mm-hmm. Douglas, Frank just mentioned some of the remaining obstacles. When do you think North Korea will be able to deploy ICBM to continental U.S.?
Well, deployment is one thing. They still, I think, need to do some tests. there may be experts who would disagree, but until you've tested at a re-entry point, which simulates the actual friction of re-entry by a warhead, you can't be sure that your system is reliable. And I think that test has yet to be done. It can really only be done at great distance. And from the U.S. perspective, if we see a test like this begin, we won't know whether it's a test or an attack. So it will actually trigger a response mechanism. Either prior to launch, there may be a temptation to preemptively attack on the ground, which would be the easiest way to hit the target. Alternatively, you wait till it launches, and if it looks like it's going to burn fuel enough to get to the U.S., then you launch missiles from Alaska to try to shoot it down. These are not optimal things to be talking about. They're probably well ahead of our ability to manage the crisis atmosphere that will accompany that kind of test. But I think the North is compelled to make that test at some point, and that could bring us to a point of crisis well before we're prepared to sit down and talk to North Korea.
So I think you just mentioned the red line that North Korea should not pass, that would not be tolerated by the Trump administration.
Well, we've had a lot of red lines. There's a General Yamaguchi in Japan who has said, we've laid down so many red lines, it's beginning to look like a red carpet.
Well, I agree with Douglas. I think that red lines are not very useful with North Korea. They've crossed so many of them. And I agree also that there's going to be a need for more testing. But I think we need to take one step back from this and acknowledge that for any U.S. president moving into 2018, they can no longer assume that North Korea doesn't have the ability to put a nuclear warhead, put it on a missile, and land it in the continental United States. Just because they haven't proven that capability doesn't mean they don't have it. And I think going forward, prudent planning requires us to basically assume that they can do it.
Right, Frank, I want to look at the international response, which was really harsh on North Korea this year. There have been 4 rounds of UN Security Council resolutions cutting down North Korean trade, fuel supply, and overseas jobs. But are we seeing some impacts from this already, or should we wait for next year?
Well, the Trump administration approach of maximum pressure and engagement, we're seeing the pressure side of that this year. But most sanctions require months, if not years, to bite. And that's certainly true of the most recent round of sanctions that affect refined petroleum products and crude oil. These are 2 of the most sensitive imports for North Korea, 2 of the imports that they rely upon 99% from the foreign community to get their oil and petroleum products. But it's going to take months, if not years, for those sanctions to fully affect the North Korean economy. They've got large stockpiles of these products. The export ban is not absolute. It's a quota system where the exporters can continue to send some petroleum and refined products to North Korea for several months. So I think 2018 will be a year during which we observe the gradual biting of these sanctions, and it's not going to happen all at once.
Douglas, we all agree that China is the key, but there is a conflicting report of China's compliance that the U.S. reconnaissance satellite caught images of Chinese vessels illegally selling oil to North Korean vessels on the West Sea. And then there's also a contrasting report from China's customs data that they didn't sell any oil to North Korea in November. Help us put all this in context.
Well, first, I think the reports are still unconfirmed of the transfer of fuel, but I wouldn't be surprised if they became confirmed. There are plenty of actors on the Chinese coastline who could, on their own, find a way to sell oil. The North probably is paying a premium to get it under these circumstances, and so it would be very tempting for outlaws. The Chinese are not used to doing things to control this. Sometimes I think they're acting in perfectly good faith. It just takes time to get the system going. But there are plenty of people who suspect China is not acting in good faith and is using this as a cutout to protect the regime from the dire effects of the sanctions. But to go back to the general point, the sanctions are going to take months to bite. In that period, the U.S. probably does not want to sit down and talk to the North because we want to see them come to the table hungry. And they won't want to come from the North to the table because they want to show that they've got capabilities that are non-negotiable before they sit down with us. So that means we probably have 6 months to a year where neither side is really going to be motivated to sit down and talk, and we'll be left with stimulus and response from tests and countermeasures, exercises, pressure points. That's going to be a dangerous year.
Right, so Douglas, I want to ask you how United States can get more Chinese cooperation on this issue. President Trump told New York Times today that his trade policies with China are linked to how China does North Korea.
Well, there are 2 points to make about that. One is the Chinese do not want to be responsible for delivering the death blow to the regime of North Korea and the consequent instability and unpredictable outcomes for Chinese own interests on the Korean Peninsula. The other side of that is China cannot, in its own, deliver a North Korean decision to abandon the weapons system. China and North Korea differ enough historically over the last 60, 70 years on many issues, and the Chinese know that they cannot deliver what's wanted. So they're a very necessary part of a solution to the North Korean problem, but they are not the full and satisfactory requirement for a solution.
I think Douglas makes a really important point, necessary but not sufficient. And we need to remember that North Korea policy is really not a U.S. job that can be outsourced to China. The United States has to have its own policy. It needs China's cooperation. But the Chinese cannot deliver the North Koreans to us ready to make a deal. That's beyond their power.
I do want to look at this report coming from Japan this week that there will be a hotline between U.S. Forces Korea and the Chinese military's Northern Theater. I think there's been a lot of serious reporting about Chinese more countermeasures against the possible instability on North Korea. Frank, was this more than previous years?
One of the things that we know for certain is that the Chinese are more willing to talk about contingency planning with the United States and even South Korea or Japan than they used to be. This used to be an absolute taboo in Beijing. They didn't want to offend their North Korean client state. But now the Chinese are preparing for the possibility of war on the peninsula. They are beefing up their presence.
I took part in informal contingency planning at a Track 2 level 4 years ago, and it was very difficult to arrange because of the sensitivity Frank has talked about, not wanting the North to have the word get to them that they're somehow thinking that the regime may be in danger. Now China is willing to take that risk, and we are seeing much more direct conversations. It always has been something where the U.S. needs to take the lead. It's not one where you'd expect the Chinese to do it. We finally got to that point, surprisingly enough, under the Trump administration, where he very directly, at the first Mar-a-Lago meeting, brought up the question of what do we do about North Korea?
Well, we'll have to wrap up our first discussion here and move on to our second topic.
Today, the United States is designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorists. Should have happened a long time ago, should have happened years ago. As we take this action today, our thoughts turn to Otto Warmbier, wonderful young man, and the countless others so brutally affected.
President Donald Trump put North Korea back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism for the first time in 9 years. When announcing this decision, President Trump cited the death of American college student Otto Warmbier, who was formerly detained in North Korea. Now, Douglas, let me give my first question to you. Will this relisting give some pains to North Korea, do you think?
I don't think it does much. It's another negotiating hurdle when we ever get back to talks with North Korea, but it doesn't have much practical consequence. We've already had the real practical consequence through American unilateral actions to deny Americans the ability to go back into Korea easily without a Treasury Department license or without a special passport, both of which are hard to come by.
Frank, what is the sentiment, the reaction from the American public on this case, the death of Otto Warmbier?
I think the American public has lost the ability to be shocked by any human rights violation that they might witness in North Korea. And the tragic death of Otto Warmbier is the same. But I think most of the American people are a compassionate people. And as Douglas pointed out, the real impact of this is the travel restrictions on U.S. citizens, most of whom who go to North Korea are involved in some kind of aid and outreach, public health, education, grassroots level welfare. And so those organizations now are really feeling the pinch. And it's one of the unfortunate consequences of North Korea's continued defiance of the UN Security Council that we now find ourselves in a situation where even those wanting to provide humanitarian outreach to the North are in a difficult spot.
Frank, you mentioned the humanitarian side. You were with the Amnesty International. I think you have answers for this. 3 Korean Americans are still held in North Korea. Tony Kim, Kim Hak-song, Kim Dong-chul. And they are denied consular access through the Swedish embassy. Isn't this a breach of the Geneva Convention?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that North Korea is not adhering to the letter or the spirit of the Geneva Convention with respect to providing adequate consular access. Unfortunately, the United States does not have an embassy in North Korea, and so we rely on the Swedes, who have been heroic in their efforts to make contact with Americans who've been arrested, to ascertain their well-being, and then to work on our behalf to help secure their release. I hope that those 3 Americans will be released in 2018 as a humanitarian gesture. It's the right thing for the North Koreans to do, and it could even spark a different mood in the U.S.-North Korea relationship that could help us get back to talks on the tough security issues.
Douglas, do you think this hostage situation can somehow spark dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington?
I'm not hopeful. The talks that they want are about how we will certify, we, the outside world, will certify they are now a true nuclear power and will give them the respect and rights that they think they can claim on that basis. And that's not a good starting point.
Frank, Secretary Tillerson said there are 2 to 3 direct channels with North Korea. Do you think there are currently negotiations to free these Americans?
I'm sure that we've made those representations, but I'm not aware of any current negotiations. You know, talking to the North Koreans is not the problem. We have multiple channels through New York and different embassies and contacts. We can get messages to North Korea. As Douglas pointed out, it's really a question of the will. You know, does North Korea have the will to try to improve their relationship with the United States? And you know, so far, our attempt to change their behavior has been focused only on the pressure, on coercive measures. We probably need to think in the new year about, as those sanctions begin to bite, what, if anything, we're prepared to do on the incentive side if we get back to the negotiating table. Because anyone who's ever tried to change the behavior of an ornery party knows that punishment is one part of it, but encouraging good behavior is another part of it. And eventually we're going to need to think about that other part of the equation.
Douglas, do you think we should give incentives to North Korea to bring it back to the table?
At some point, yes. I don't think we're at that point now. As I mentioned in the previous segment, the timing where both sides are really ready to talk to each other has not with us yet.
I think that's right. I mean, right now we're still struggling.
And so you could risk sending create misunderstanding through signals that might be read by the other side as indicating that we've agreed to their premise for the negotiation, when in fact there's a great disagreement about the premise of accepting North Korea as an established nuclear power. And so this is still months to be played out. But we have an assortment of tools, whether they're bilateral pressures, multilateral pressures, exercises, international isolation, losing jobs, losing embassies overseas. All of these things are part of a mix. But there are also things we have not done that could be both incentives and disincentives to North Korea that have not been deployed yet. I have to say, I don't think that the Trump administration has come up with a comprehensive policy on North Korea yet. I don't see the outlines for that.
Well, we'll end this discussion here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today is about a man who dared to ride piggyback on the leader Kim Jong-un. This man is believed to have played a key role in a missile engine test. This picture was taken at the West Sea Missile Launch Control Center in March. Frank, what's your reaction to this photo?
Well, you know, it looks like young boys in the schoolyards, you know, celebrating a victory, a goal in a soccer match or something. And I think it's been a year of celebration for the North Korean missile technicians and the Korean People's Army. They have to be very satisfied with what they've delivered to Kim Jong-un this year in a variety of presents. And that he would dare to sort of, you know, climb on the back of the dear leader and that the dear leader was physically able to hold him. I think it probably speaks to the diminished size of the Korean People's Army soldiers. They're not too heavy. And maybe the well-fed strength of Kim Jong-un.
Douglas?
Well, this picture really caught my eye when it came out. And, you know, it's been our photo analysts in the U.S. government have looked carefully at the people who've been at these celebrations after successful missile tests or nuclear tests. And it's quite clear that that's a privileged elite who are being rapidly promoted and been given a lot of adulation because they're reflecting well on the leadership of Kim Jong-un. So I think there's room for both sides to give and take in appreciation of each other's efforts to advance the North Korean capabilities.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Douglas, Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from VOA, and I'm Eunjung Cho. This is the last episode for 2017, but I hope to see you next year.